For the 2 years that we lived in Colorado when I was a seminary intern, we took every opportunity we could to get up into the mountains and just explore the wonders of the wildlife and the plant life and the just vast variety of landscapes. And my favorite in all of that, and this could happen when you're driving on an interstate or on a little windy mountain road, was to see what I call surprise waterfalls. Because you would just be driving along and you would look up and right there, coming out the rock, would be water. And I never really knew if they were waterfalls that were always there from like a stream that fed them, or if snow melt was just finding its way down the mountain. And we call them waterfalls because the water always falls down, and that is because gravity always pulls water downhill. This is always true. Gravity, as a force, pulls water downhill. It's why when we build something that has a drain in the floor, we slope the floor toward the drain, because the gravity will pull the water there. Today we hear a challenging Bible text from Jesus, challenging for us in our day, because he talks about divorce and he talks about marriage. And in our culture, we don't have a great success rate at marriage, and we have lots of divorce around us. We've got gender questions and all sorts of stuff. And to understand this text in our day, we have to kind of understand it in Jesus' day, but we also have to have a lens for interpreting it. We always have a lens that we bring to Scripture. All of our experiences and stories come there. And so today I just want to make sure we have an implicit lens that we're using to help us understand this. And that lens is that just as gravity pulls water downhill, God's grace is always pulling us toward life. That's just the way it works. Gravity pulls water downhill, grace pulls us toward life. It's the whole story of Scripture. Think about the story of Exodus. The people are in slavery, which is not life-giving. And God pulls them out of that through the wilderness to a new place where there is new life. In the book of Ruth, Naomi has these two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, and they go and they get married, and that's how they become her daughters-in-law. But then all the men die, and then Naomi and Ruth go back to the land that Naomi came from. And this is a story where God is pulling them from a place of death to a place of life. Grace always pulling towards life. When you get to the exile, the people are carried out of Israel to Babylon, and eventually God takes them home. It's grace pulling them toward life. When you get to the New Testament, every encounter Jesus has with people is pulling them toward life. Sometimes that's healing. Sometimes it's casting out demons. Sometimes it's challenging something in them to get them to think differently that brings them to a place of new life. Even in death, Jesus is dragging us toward life. He goes to the cross, and in that place of the cross, he is dragging us to this new resurrection life. So that is always the way that moves, right? God's grace comes to us, we don't go get it, and it is always pulling us toward life. So if gravity pulls water downhill and grace pulls us toward life, that's going to be the lens we have today. Now, to keep that lens in front of us, I'm going to make you have to respond with the refrain. So every time I say gravity pulls water downhill, you have to say grace pulls us toward life. Right? So we're going to practice. Gravity pulls water downhill.
Grace pulls us toward life.
Gravity pulls water downhill.
Grace pulls us toward life.
All right, good. So, as we jump into this Bible text, the first thing we need to understand is, I'm going to pretend that this happened on a Tuesday. Jesus did not wake up that Tuesday and decide, today is the day that I'm going to go sit in front of all the people and give them my definitive forever teaching about marriage and divorce. Jesus did not get up and do that day, and we know that because Jesus is just going along, and the Pharisees want to test him. Why? Because they want to trap him and trick him so they can get rid of him. So the Pharisees are the ones that come and ask the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? So the whole story begins with them trying to trap Jesus. Now, gravity pulls water downhill. Grace pulls us towards life. So we have to look in this story and say, how is this story telling us about how grace pulls us toward life? Well, we have to understand divorce in the first century, and also understand that Jesus doesn't see the problem in the text as divorce. Because as soon as they ask the question, he asks them, what did Moses say, and they answer that, and he puts the problem where? Back to them and their hardness of heart. They ask about divorce, Jesus says, well, no, you have hard hearts. That's the problem. So, today, in our present culture, if, imagine with me a couple, man, woman, two kids, The man has a midlife crisis, decides he wants a sports car, and doesn't want to be married anymore, and so he dismisses his wife in a divorce, and she's now a single mom of 2 kids. Is that an easy path in our culture? No. We all know that's not. And yet, in our culture, women can get jobs. They may not get paid the same as men, but they get jobs. We have Medicaid if you don't have enough money to pay for health care. We have food stamps. We have other kind of support networks, right? And it's still hard. So if we back up to Jesus' day, were women readily employable? Did they have food stamps? Medicaid? No, right? None of these kind of support things that we have that makes it even hard for us. They didn't have any of that. And so if you think about biblical widows and orphans, all through the prophets, they hassle the people and say, you're not paying attention to the widows and orphans. These are people who couldn't take care of themselves. So for a man to divorce his wife would be to cast her out into a culture sort of unattached in a place that would have been very difficult for her to get along and thrive. So they could just as easily have asked Jesus the question in a different way. Instead of saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, they could have said, is it okay if we just kick our women out and leave them to fend for themselves in a world for that's very difficult? And what's Jesus' answer? No, because that is not life-giving. So when Jesus says no and starts to talk about marriage, he's really talking about, for them in their way, in their culture, how it would be that this could be a gift of life for her, right? And that gift of life comes in being sheltered and fed and provided for in the culture in the way that it worked. Now you also can probably tell that this really isn't about a divorce ultimately, because the very next thing that happens is that kids are trying to get to Jesus. And why would people bring their kids to Jesus? Well, because when Jesus touches people, amazing things happen. And the disciples say, no, right? They're dismissive of the kids. So at the beginning of this passage, you have men that are wanting to be dismissive of women, and now you have disciples being dismissive of kids. And Jesus says, knock it off, right? That's not life-giving. What's life-giving is to let them come to me and not get in the way. So all through this story, what we see is that gravity pulls water downhill.
Grace pulls us toward life.
Grace pulls us toward life, and that's what Jesus is doing. So then we can say, all right, that's what's going on then. What happens in our culture today? What can this text speak to us? And the first thing I think we should probably do is get into that mode of confession and say, how is it that we dismiss people? And when I think about that, I think of, I got people in my head, I'm not going to tell you who they are, but people that I have been dismissive of just because I didn't want to be around them. Not for their fault of their own, really, just I didn't want to be around them. I think of people that I dismissed, even good friends who I just got tired of hearing their opinions and tired of having those conversations. And so I became dismissive, right? Dismissive of that relationship. I think of times I've probably spoken over people rather than letting their voice come forth and being dismissive of that. And the one that really is bad is the people that we just don't even notice. Like we don't even see them. And then that way we can be dismissive. Now all of that are the people that I see all the time, right? Then there are the people who cry out for help. And if you pay attention to Jesus in the stories of the Gospels, he never dismisses anybody. Today, the Pharisees are asking him hard questions. He could just wave a hand at them and say, I'm not going to deal with you guys. But he doesn't. He hangs in there with them and has those conversations. And then when people cry out for help and healing, Jesus stops. He never dismisses anybody. Even on the cross. He didn't dismiss anybody, right? He went to the cross for the whole of creation. And so Jesus teaches us, like, don't dismiss people, and yet we dismiss people that are around us. And then there's the ways we collectively dismiss people. I'm just giving you one example. I want you to imagine that a young African-American woman comes into my office this week and tells me, gosh, Pastor, I've always felt like I'm just not quite a full citizen in this country. Like, I don't feel like my life is valued, and just tells the whole story. And then at the end says, I just need to know that Black lives matter. And I'm going to give you two choices of my response. The first one is, I'm really sorry to hear that, and I wish I understood. Thank you for sharing your story. I would love to hear more so you could help me maybe understand and we could build a relationship to journey into a new future together. Or I could say, all lives matter. Which one of those is dismissive? Second one, right? Because I didn't listen, I didn't hear, and I immediately jumped to think, why would I do that? Well, we do that because we get uncomfortable, or we don't understand, or we land in those places where we don't want to see, and it's just too much, and so we just get dismissive. And so whether we dismiss people because we just don't see them, or we're uncomfortable with them, or we don't understand them, it all ends up in the same place where we're dismissing people. Which then gets us to the second part of the text, or what it can teach us, which is, it can teach us about grace, right? Gravity pulls water downhill. So if we look at this and say, how does it tell us about grace pulling us towards life? I think the easiest way to do that is to actually look for examples. How do we know, don't repeat it this time, how do we know that gravity pulls water downhill? We see it, right? You throw water up, always comes down. How do we know that grace pulls us towards life? We see it, and we recognize it, and we reflect on it as God at work in the world. So in our culture where many marriages finish in divorce, right, we could look at this Bible text and go, well, Jesus is clearly saying you should never do that because that's adultery. But then we have people who are in abusive marriages. And I've had these conversations with people, right? And so if you think about an abusive marriage that ends in a divorce, can that be a gift of grace that leads to life? Absolutely it can, right? So if Jesus' whole point is don't dismiss people, and that it is a gift of grace that leads to the life that Jesus gives us, then we have to look and say sometimes a marriage ending in divorce is the gift of grace that leads to life. And that marriage continuing would not have been life-giving. Likewise, I've had a couple of couples that I know that are same-gender couples who have been together for like 3 or 4 decades. Right? And in the early part of those 3 or 4 decades, would that have been an acceptable relationship in our culture? No way, right? And yet, Jesus in the story talks about a man and woman coming together and being joined. That word for joined is not just like a contract, which is kind of in some ways we think about marriage. It's more of a devotion and a faithfulness. And so these couples found a devotion and a faithfulness that has lasted for 30 or 40 years. Is that a gift of grace that leads to life? Of course it is, right? And so I think about my own grandparents. My dad's parents were married for 62 years. Grandpa had a stroke in the 60th year of those 62. And my little old grandma, after their Medicare wouldn't pay for rehab anymore or whatever, she would get him out of bed, put him in a wheelchair, take him in the bathroom, put him on the toilet, get him off the toilet. She would bathe him, she would dress him, she would feed him. She did everything for 2 years. And every time I think about that, I think about wedding vows. And how that is the picture of for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, and sickness and health until death do we part. And even in those years, right, where he couldn't move half of his body and death was coming, was that a gift of grace that led to life? Yes, right? This amazing gift of grace that leads to life comes even to the hardest places where we are. I have a friend who has a transgendered son. For like 2 decades, this son was known as a daughter and spent all of this time wrestling with how is it that I understand myself in a culture that understands me differently, and there's all these expectations, and all of this long, torturous wrestling, and finally got into a place where saying, this is what I think I am. Felt like he could say that in front of parents who were supportive and all culture that surrounded them that allowed them to feel safe to do this and to share their story and tell their story. Does that sound like a gift of grace that leads to life? Yes, right? So when we hear these words from Jesus that sound very specific about divorce and about marriage and about kids, what we have to do is understand that what is happening around him is people are trying to get rid of him because he doesn't dismiss people. And so Jesus starts to invite them to stop dismissing people because gravity pulls water downhill. Grace pulls us toward life, right? And so Jesus invites us today to do that. Now, we just baptized little Kieran in these waters. There are some traditions of Christianity that only believe you should immerse people for baptism. And the idea there, I think, is that in going into that water fully, you drown your new life, your old life, and then you come out the new life the other side. Perfectly good theological thinking there. Our pot is kind of tiny, so I can't sink a whole little one in there. So we just kind of go like this. Now, what's happening to that water when I pull it up? Going down, right? So think about that as an image. Just as the gravity is pulling water downhill, that is a visual picture of how God's grace works, right? It comes down to us, it falls on us, it brings us life. Now the trick with all that is just remembering that that God is always pulling us toward life, that grace is always pulling us toward life, and that for each and every one of us, there's no way that God's going to stop loving us, and that God is always pulling us toward life. The question I have for you then is, what if we are also the gravity? Amen.